This is the tale of two ships named USS Nipsic, one built for blockade, chase, and battle in the shallow waters of the Carolinas, the other built for the long years of peace, diplomacy, and exploration following the Civil War. At the outset of the Civil War, a blockade was declared, but it's one thing to declare a blockade and another thing to enforce it. The U.S. Navy was tiny. It purchased merchant ships into service. It ordered a number of ships built, including the 23 ships of the Unadilla class. These were 158-foot-long gunboats mounting a single heavy gun like an 11-inch Dahlgren and a couple lighter ones as well. Between the purchased ships and the built ships, the Navy vastly expanded. The Confederates responded by selecting fast, shallow-draft ships that could run the blockade to do so, and eventually purpose-built ships were ordered that were fast, low, and frankly could outrun most of the U.S. Navy vessels on blockade duty. Some of those vessels were derisively termed armed buoys, as the blockade runners were able to slip in and out of ports like Charleston and Wilmington, providing a much-needed lifeline to the Confederacy. The Kansas-class gunboats, of which USS Nipsic was one, were about 20 feet longer and 140 tons heavier, 2 feet wider than the previous design of the Unadilla class. They were therefore a bit more capable ships. They were better able to fire their guns in a little bit heavier weather. Most importantly, they're faster. This photo of USS Kansas shows the class as originally built. Note the very minimal sailing rig, including the lack of a bowsprit. These ships were designed to be primarily steamers. The sails were auxiliary. A 30-pounder Parrott rifles mounted on the forecastle. The main armament, a single heavy gun, is mounted amidships. There is a 9-inch Dahlgren on each broadside and light armament on the quarterdeck. USS Nipsic shows a topsail schooner rig. Again, note the lack of a bowsprit. These ships were designed for the blockade. They were designed to be fast steamers. This wartime view of USS Nipsic's deck shows a 150-pounder or 8-inch Parrott rifle mounted amidships as a pivot. It could be pivoted to fire on either broadside. This view from the quarterdeck shows the lighter 24-pounder boat howitzers mounted really as anti-personnel weapons in case of boat attack or for firing against infantry ashore. The first crew of USS Nipsic was primarily drawn from Boston. They shipped aboard first USS Ohio, a receiving ship in the area. They got their first taste of naval life there. You can see they were born from all over New England, but also England and Ireland as well. They spent their first days in the U.S. Navy, again, aboard the old receiving ship USS Ohio. Nipsic arrived in South Carolina waters in November of 1863. Admiral Dahlgren was pleased by the ship. Nipsic's first action involved the old sailing brig USS Perry. Perry was on patrol near Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, when she spotted a schooner being fitted out as a blockade runner. Perry's captain sent a landing party ashore with orders to take and destroy the schooner. However, this landing party was ambushed by Confederate cavalry, and many of its members captured, including the captain's own 17-year-old son and an African-American sailor from Connecticut by the name of George Brimsmaid. Admiral Dahlgren was going to have none of this. He ordered Nipsic and several other ships up to Murrells Inlet to destroy that Confederate cavalry base and the schooner. Nipsic landed several boats, including one commanded by an ensign from USS South Carolina, who took their boat howitzer and used it to bombard and destroy the schooner. Part of the mission of these sailors and Marines who had landed to destroy the schooner and the Confederate cavalry base was to ascertain what had happened to the boat's crew, including the sailor George Brimsmaid. There were rumors that he had been hanged by the Confederates. Unfortunately, those rumors proved to be true. When the officer who had commanded the captured boat's crew was later released, he submitted a report which described George Brimsmaid's hanging, really lynching by the Confederates. It also notes how a wounded U.S. Navy sailor was shot out of hand by a Confederate officer, and how even by late 1864 it was known that 2 of the other sailors had died in captivity. This report underlines just how dangerous it was for sailors and Marines of the blockading squadron, lest they be captured ashore, and also the specific danger faced by African American sailors serving with the fleet. Another incident which underlines this fact occurred in February of 1864 when one of USS Nipsic's boat's crews was on patrol near Fort Sumter, between Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, and they got a little bit too close to the forts. They were captured by a Confederate boat, and the enlisted sailors were sent to Andersonville, where by the end of 1864 all had died from sickness or disease. Serving on the blockade was dangerous, difficult work, often boring, but could easily turn fatal. At 4 a.m. on September 14, 1864, one of the blockaders, USS Winona, noticed Confederate torpedo boats being prepared near Breach Inlet on the north end of Sullivan's Island. Winona fired rockets. Nipsic was one of the first blockaders to respond. The ships wound up in a gunnery duel with Battery Marshall on the north end of Sullivan's Island. During the engagement, Nipsic fired 47 shells. She covered another blockader that had run aground as that ship was refloated. Following the Confederate withdrawal from Charleston, Nipsic went to the Georgetown, South Carolina area at Winyah Bay. She was part of the force that took the abandoned Confederate fortification Battery White. She was also on hand in case CSS PD, a gunboat being built at the Mars Bluff shipyard near Florence, South Carolina, in case PD sortied. Of course, PD never did. She was destroyed by her own crew, and her guns can be seen on display in Florence, South Carolina, near the National Cemetery. It's interesting to imagine what might have happened had CSS PD sortied to face Nipsic and the other gunboats at Georgetown. The role Nipsic actually played was as temporary flagship of Rear Admiral Dahlgren after Dahlgren's flagship Harvest Moon hit a torpedo near Battery White and sank. The wreck of Harvest Moon can still be seen today. The fighting ended. USS Nipsic's 150-pounder parrot rifle was replaced with a lighter 100-pounder or 6.4-inch parrot rifle. This very parrot rifle, number 167, can still be seen at the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines. The lighter gun seems to have helped USS Nipsic's sailing abilities on the open ocean, and the rest of her career would be much more about exploring the deep ocean than fighting on the coast. In the immediate aftermath of the war, USS Nipsic served on the Brazil station. In 1868, she received a refit and was given the brig rig shown in this National Archives plan. The Navy at the time was placing more and more emphasis on sail power as it was both cash-strapped, and its mission was now much more about exploration and visiting foreign countries around the world. Also in 1868, she was placed under the command of Thomas Selfridge. His initial mission with the ship was to scout locations around Haiti and the Dominican Republic as possible locations for a future naval station. Sometime around 1870, she was given a third mast, becoming a full-rigged ship at this point. And in 1870 and 1871, again under Selfridge, she would be part of two expeditions to the Panama coast to try to find the route for a future canal. Selfridge wrote that we were to find that in spite of the most careful preparations, the success of the expedition depended upon extraordinary persistence and willingness to endure hardships. The tropical sun, torrential rains, floods, raging currents, swamps, dense vegetation, venomous snakes, blood-sucking bats, tarantulas, scorpions, hornets, wildcats, sandflies, and mosquitoes so thick that I have seen them put out a lighted candle with their burned bodies. All were to test our resolution to the utmost. These were the difficulties which had kept the secrets of the interior of the isthmus locked up for hundreds of years. Selfridge described an early day in the ship's expedition thusly: the reconnoitering party's first night in camp was decidedly disagreeable. It began to rain hard, and the rapidly rising river soon washed us out of our frail tenements, which had been constructed close to the banks in the supposition that it was the dry season. The morning found us wet and tired after a sleepless night in what we dubbed Rainy Hollow. where the day was spent in resting and waiting for the small survey party to catch up. On the following morning, the advance was resumed, though our guides refused to go any farther, and soon we were struggling over a rough and precipitate ridge in the face of heavy rain. At one point, a stream had to be crossed. The advance waded through knee-deep. 10 minutes after, when I came up, the waters were breast-high, foaming and tearing over the boulders at not less than 5 miles an hour. But by felling a tree, the remainder of the men were able to cross. 4 hours of this kind of marching took us over the ridge and to the headwaters of another stream, when the men were so exhausted that we made camp at 3 p.m. Among the party were veteran soldiers who declared that no march during the war had equaled the severity of this one. The expedition of salvaged Nipsic and the other U.S. Navy ships and, of course, sailors added to United States knowledge of the Panama coast. However, it would be not until the beginning of another century that the canal would be successfully built. By 1873, USS Nipsic was thoroughly rotten and worn out. She was one of a number of war-built ships that had been built quickly and out of unseasoned timber, and they rotted just as quickly. The Navy was faced with a difficult choice. It did not have enough ships, but Congress still had the idea that they'd paid for all these ships not too many years ago, and some of them had never even entered service. Why did the Navy need yet more ships? So the Navy, underfunded and with Congress unwilling to pay for new ships, decided that instead of spreading out the repair bills to cover the whole fleet, it would concentrate on just a few ships. It would repair the ones that were worth repairing, and from among those that were simply not worth repairing, it would select a few ships for a great repair. In practice, this meant that the old ship was broken up and a new ship to a new design meant to meet the Navy's different needs of the time was built. USS Nipsic was one of these. In 1874, she was broken apart. The old ship disappeared at Washington Navy Yard, and a new ship of the Enterprise class, or Essex class, was built. The new ship was about 1,375 tons, whereas the old ship had been 835 tons. It was also 6 feet longer and 5 feet wider on the beam. It was also probably a good bit deeper in the hull. It was a larger ship, whereas the old ship had been designed to be a war-built vessel for maximum numbers of construction, to be as fast as possible. The new Nipsic was a slower ship designed for long-range ocean cruising, keeping its crew in relative comfort. In official parlance, USS Nipsic and her sisters were third-rate steamers of 6 guns. Sometimes they were called sloops of war, oftentimes they were called gunboats. Their main armament was a single 8-inch muzzle-loading rifle capable of firing a 180-pound projectile with a 35-pound propellant charge. These guns had been converted from 11-inch Dahlgrens, but were much more powerful, especially at range. They were also much more powerful than the 150-pounder Parrott rifles or 8-inch Parrott rifles that the ships had mounted during the Civil War. In testing, the 8-inch rifles were shown to be able to punch through up to 7 inches of iron armor at 1,000 yards. The ships also carried 4 9-inch Dahlgrens, 2 on each broadside. These 1850s-era guns had given good service during the American Civil War. By the 1870s and 1880s, they were really only suitable for firing against soft targets at relatively close range. One of USS Nipsic's 9-inch Dahlgrens actually still exists. Number 933 is displayed in Farragut, Tennessee by a statue, a memorial to Admiral David Farragut. The sign by the Dahlgren says that it was mounted on USS Hartford. I've not yet found that connection. However, U.S. Navy records show that it was mounted on USS Nipsic from the new ship's commissioning in 1879 through at least 1890. It's easy to dismiss Nipsic and her sisters as wooden-hulled, sail-powered anachronisms in an era when the major powers were building increasingly powerful ships out of iron and steel, ships that would develop into the battleships of the 20th century. However, Nipsic and her sisters were not meant to fight battles. They were meant to be floating diplomatic missions, consular offices of the United States. They were meant to assist U.S. efforts around the world, whether they be governmental efforts or the efforts of private citizens. They were meant to explore. They were meant to entertain princes and government officials aboard. Nipsic served first on the Mediterranean station and then on the African station, and in the late 1880s was assigned to the Pacific station. As tensions began to mount between the United States and the German Empire over Samoa, USS Nipsic was sent there. She was later reinforced by the somewhat larger USS Vandalia and the much larger and more powerful USS Trenton. The three American ships faced off against an equal number of German ships, watched over by HMS Calliope. It seemed all too possible that the conflict might boil over to war, and Nipsic and the other American ships might be in a naval battle against the German ships. Of course, on March 15, 1889, a powerful cyclone hit Samoa. Of the 7 warships in the harbor, only HMS Calliope had the powerful engines necessary to get out of the harbor to the relative safety of open water. The 3 German and 3 American warships were all beached or wrecked. Of the American warships, USS Vandalia was sunk, suffering fearsome casualties. USS Trenton sank, but only partially. Her upper decks remained above water, and many of her crew and Vandalia's crew sought refuge there. Only USS Nipsic would see service again. Her crew retained some control of the ship and were able to coax the engines by throwing pork fat over the fires, to get that last push to beach their ship upon a gentle beach, and therefore saved themselves and ultimately saved their ship. USS Nipsic, alone among the American ships, was able to be salvaged. She was first a rudder was rigged for her as she had lost her rudder, and she made her way to Hawaii, where she received some repairs, eventually went to the west coast of the U.S. She saw relatively little sailing service after that point, but instead went to Puget Sound, where she would spend about 25 years as a station ship. Plans exist in the National Archives showing her fitted out as a prison ship. I'm actually not sure if she served in that role or not, but she lasted until 1913. USS Nipsic's story is the story of the U.S. Navy during the Civil War, fighting on the coast, fighting the blockade, but also the story of the Navy in the years of peace that followed. A ship of exploration, a ship that was rebuilt using the narrow parameters that were given to the Navy to keep going during those lean years. The Navy had a ship of an old design, designed for a different purpose, and they built a new ship. And they hid it, meaning that Nipsic's identity is still confused between the old ship and new. If you go look at the Wikipedia page, there's only one entry for both ships. If you look at the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, there's only one entry for both ships. But she was 2 ships, or rather, there were 2 ships named Nipsic. This has been their story. It's also the story of the sailors who fought, and in several cases died, serving with USS Nipsic. It's to their memory that I tell it. I'm Santee 1821. I photograph artifacts and artillery of the U.S. Navy and try to tell the stories of the ships, but most importantly, the sailors that sailed upon them during the 19th century. Follow me for more. Thank you so much.